Welcome, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the lands on which we gather today. For me, it is the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people who have lived on this land since time immemorial. And I am reminded every day of my gratitude for this land, for its many generations of caretakers. And I believe that even in this virtual environment that we're in today, we have a responsibility to understand the longstanding history that's brought us to the lands that we live on and work from and play on. And we also share in the responsibility of learning and unlearning and working together to create equitable change. So wherever you are joining us from, just as some of you have already done, which I so appreciate, I encourage you to share your own acknowledgement in the chat. This is one way that we can all take a step together towards deeper understanding. So much appreciated to those of you who have already done so. I am your host today. My name is Leah Kogan. I'm part of the Expert Community on Housing admin team here at CMHC. And we're so glad to have you with us for this webinar titled Unsheltered Sorrows, Facing Grief, Loss, and End of Life When Older and Homeless. Before I dive into introducing this session, how it came to be, and the wonderful speakers we have here with us today, I want to spend just our customary 2 minutes here to get you all set up so that you can make the most of the session today. As you've already been doing, please use the chat. It's such a lovely, warm reminder that you're here with us. Feel free to share resources. ECoH is all about the community coming together to enrich each other with what we each know in our individual areas of expertise. So by all means, share resources, ideas, questions there. And then also interact with us using the reaction buttons. If you know how to access those, it gives us a good feeling as we're sharing with you here as panelists. And just so that you know, after the presentation, there will be some time for a Q&A, and we encourage you to use this distinctive Q&A function. That just helps us to manage the questions in sequence. It's easier to find than combing through the chat. So you can see that there's a Q&A box that has two speech bubbles, and you can use that to input your questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll draw from that at the end for our Q&A. And you can input those at any time. And as I mentioned, our webinar today is in both official languages. We're so lucky that that is the case. But for those of you who require full English or full French, you have that option because we have the wonderful Yannick here to interpret for us throughout the course of the webinar. All you need to do in order to access that is go to the interpretation icon, which is a globe, typically at the bottom of your screen. Click on that and you'll see you can toggle, you can select English, French, or the original sound, which today will be bilingual, if you'd like to experience it that way. And of course, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A in the language of your choice, and we will answer accordingly. One final quick item before we dig in is ECoH is really a member-driven initiative, and therefore we invite our members to join us, as Émilie and Jeff are today, to share their own expertise. And so as a result of that, they really are the ones to reach out to connect with, to learn more if your interest is piqued and you want to dig in further. So we will be sharing their contact information in the follow-up email that we'll be sending in a couple days, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of the webinar. In addition to that, we'll be sending you the recording, so if you're wondering how you'll be able to share this content with others who weren't able to make it today, we'll make sure you get those recording links. And so that is it for our participation notes, but as always, message us in the chat if there's anything you need from us. And my colleague Sandy's supporting on that today. So thank you, Sandy. Okay, so our session today, we're going to hear from researchers from the AIRP partnership, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Émilie and Jeff, it stands for Aging in Right Place. And this partnership is a jointly funded initiative, NHS initiative, supported by CMHC and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And it is made up of a national team of academic academics who are researching aging in right place as it relates to housing and homelessness. And they've been sharing the results of their work with us for a few years now and have deeply enriched the conversations that we've had here. And so we're so pleased to have them here again today. And the focus of today's sessions, as I'm sure you intuited from the description, will focus on the different forms of grief and loss that older homeless persons experience and face prior to, during, following their experiences of homelessness, as well as taking a special look at how the absence of grief and palliative frameworks in Canadian policies and housing services creates a circumstance of suffocated grief that threatens older homeless persons and their capacity to thrive when they've been rehoused and potentially inhibits, in some cases, their access to competent palliative spaces at end of life. This is a very important topic, and we're so thrilled to have Émilie and Jeff here to share with us today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. But just to say quickly that we were expecting to have Professor Tamara Sussman with us today, but she had a medical emergency. So our thoughts are with her, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to hear from her in future. But Tamara is the professor in the School of Social Work at McGill University who's supporting and overseeing the Montreal chapter of this partnership initiative. But Émilie Cormier is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Psychology at the University of Quebec in Montreal and a doctoral trainee with the Aging in the Right Place project. Her doctoral work explores older homeless people's experiences with end-of-life care in Montreal. So thank you for being with us, Émilie. And Jeffrey Walsh is a doctoral candidate in the School of Social Work at McGill University and a doctoral trainee with the Aging in Right Place project as well. And his doctoral work explores promising practices in hospice care for older persons experiencing homelessness. So welcome to you both. Again, deeply grateful to have you here to share the insights of your work with us. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Jeff, and I will take over the slides for you.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that introduction, Leah. So as Leah mentioned, my name is Jeff Walsh, and alongside Émilie Cormier, we're going to be presenting today. I'm going to move to the next slide. The acknowledgement. Great. Thank you. Leah did a great job acknowledging our funders and our partners. The only thing, and doing a land acknowledgement, we just want to also acknowledge the lands that Émilie and I are joining from. So Émilie Cormier is joining from the unceded traditional territories of the Gahage, sorry. And I'm joining today from the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish, which includes the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And we just invite people to reflect on the lands in which they're joining us from today, and our shared responsibility of upholding Indigenous rights and working towards truth and reconciliation. Um, our webinar today is going to focus on the topic of grief, particularly or specifically with older adults who are experiencing homelessness. And so we just want to give an idea of what grief is, just so we all have a similar understanding as we talk about today. So, grief is a healthy, necessary, and normal response to loss. It's expected, and we experience it when we experience a loss. It's also a whole mind and body experience. And it really differs based on the person. And the other part is that is also culturally influenced. So different cultures will experience grief differently and also address grief differently. And just the last piece is that grief is worthy of support, and that every person who is experiencing grief is worthy of support, which I think is a really important um, piece for us to acknowledge as we kind of talk about grief with older adults who are experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. So more specifically, when we talk about grief and loss with older people who are experiencing homelessness, there are some unique and unrecognized ways that grief and bereavement impact or show up in the lives of older homeless people. So one of them is the death of a spouse is actually a really significant risk factor for becoming homeless with older age, particularly with women. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later in the presentation. The other thing is that older people experiencing homelessness um, have an increased rate and risk of premature, unsupported death. And they also are exposed to death much more frequently than the general population. Um, the other thing is that it's not just death that older homeless people experience or where they experience loss. There's also many non-death losses that can trigger grief. So that could be things like loss of a symbolic or a physical home, loss of social status as one becomes homeless or one ages while being homeless, as well as loss of opportunities. And despite having kind of this increased exposure to death or increased exposure to grief and loss, it's rarely focused or frameworks are rarely focused on shaping responses for aging and homelessness as people grieve. Next slide. And so, with all that in mind, we really want to kind of talk about two of our research studies that really shed light on the ways in which older people experiencing homelessness experience grief and loss. The first one's going to be presented by Émilie Cormier, and it's going to look at how experiences of grief and loss are expressed and addressed in transitional housing. And then it'll come back to me, and I'll talk about how the intersections of homelessness and end of life are discussed and attended to in Canadian policy. And then we're going to integrate our recommendations throughout that, but we will have one slide at the end just to kind of pull it back together. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Émilie.
Merci Jeff d'avoir mis la
Thank
table.
you, Jeff, for setting the
Donc,
stage.
je prends le relais en fait pour vous
So
présenter
I will
les principales conclusions d'un
talk
article en
about the
vérité
main
juste que j'ai
conclusions
publié.
of an
C'est
article we
un
just
article qui a été
published.
publié
It's
en
an article
anglais
that
et
was
qui est
published
en
in
libre accès.
English,
Donc, si
and
jamais
it
vous avez
is
envie d'en apprendre davantage, vous
freely
pouvez le
accessible. So if
lire.
you want to learn
Je sais que
more,
Léa va
or
mettre
I
le
know that
lien vers
Leah will
l'article dans la
post the
boîte de
link
description.
towards the article or
Donc,
the
cet
paper in
article-là, en
the chat.
fait,
So
présente
this
les données,
paper
les
presents
résultats
the
d'une collecte de
data, the
données qu'on
results
a
of a
conduit
data
à
collection
Montréal, dans la
that
province de
we
Québec,
did in Montreal, in the province
relativement
of
justement
Quebec,
au projet Vieillir au bon endroit
about
que Léa
Aging in
vous
the Right
a
Place project
décrit un peu
that
brièvement
Leah
tantôt.
described at the
Donc,
beginning.
on peut changer de diapositive, Léa, s'il vous
Please
plaît.
move on to the next slide.
Donc, cette collecte de données-là, on l'a conduite dans une ressource
We
d'hébergement qui était
collected this data
qualifiée de
in
transitoire
a
à long terme.
transition
Donc,
home,
ce
a
que ça
long-term
signifiait
transition home.
plus précisément, c'est que l'organisme
What
qui
that
gère
means is that
cette
the
ressource
organization that manages
d'hébergement-là
this
s'attend à ce que les personnes qui y
transition home
résident
expects
soient
people
éventuellement
residing
relocalisées
there
dans un logement
to be
permanent,
eventually
mais sans
relocated to a
vraiment
permanent
imposer de
housing,
temps strict pour cette
but they don't
transition-là.
impose a
Donc,
strict
parmi les personnes
deadline
qu'on a
for that
rencontrées,
move. So
nous,
among
il
the
y avait
people we
certaines
met,
personnes qui résidaient
some
dans
of
cette
them
ressource d'hébergement
lived
transitoire à
in
long
that
terme depuis
transition
moins d'un
home,
mois,
long-term
alors que
transition home.
certaines
They were there
autres y
for less than a
résidaient
month.
depuis plus de 4
Others
ans.
were
Donc, il y a
there
quand même
for
un bon
more
écart
than
de
4
durée de
years.
séjour.
So there's
La ressource
a gap
d'hébergement
between the
offre
extremes of
14 chambres privées
stay duration.
semi-meublées
So there are
qui
4
sont destinées
private
à des personnes
rooms,
âgées de plus de
semi-furnished,
50 ans
for
qui ont
people
connu l'itinérance.
over 50
On
years
leur
of age
offre
that
là-bas 2
have been
repas
through
par jour
homelessness. They are
qui
offered
sont
2
déjà
meals a
cuisinés
day
pour eux,
that
et on
are
leur
prepared
fournit
for
aussi des
them,
ingrédients pour qu'ils
and
puissent
they are
eux-mêmes
also
se cuisiner
provided the
leur petit
ingredients
déjeuner.
that so that they can
Les personnes
prepare their
restantes
own
n'ont pas
breakfast.
accès à
The
la
residents don't have
cuisine
access
communautaire pour
to
se
the
préparer
community
eux-mêmes des
kitchen
repas
to prepare their
pour ce
meals
qui est des autres
themselves,
repas dans la journée.
other than for
Les personnes
breakfast.
résidentes de cette ressource-là
The residents
bénéficient
of
d'un
this
soutien
resource
psychosocial.
also
Ce que
receive
c'est
psychosocial
principalement, c'est vraiment un
support,
soutien pour la prise de
which
rendez-vous
consists
médicaux et
in
autres, et
support
aussi
for
soutien à
taking
tout ce qui est démarches
medical appointments
administratives
and appointments
dans le
for
cadre de suivis qui sont
for
hebdomadaires ou
administrative
bi-hebdomadaires avec
actions
l'intervenant qui est
in,
assigné à chacune des personnes résidentes. Les
and
résidents
they
paient
have access to
l'équivalent de 60
a
de leur
resource for
chèque d'aide
this. They
sociale
pay
pour avoir accès à
60%
cette ressource
of their
d'hébergement-là qui est
social
aussi
assistance
fournie à eux.
income to have access to this
Donc, pour comprendre
uh,
l'expérience
transition
des
home.
personnes
And to
résidentes de
understand
cette
the experience
ressource-là,
of
on a
the
utilisé la
residents of
méthode d'entrevue
this resource,
photo-voix,
we
qui était
use the
déjà la méthode de
photo
collecte de
voice
données qui était prévue dans le cadre
interview
du projet
method,
Vieillir
which
au bon endroit.
is what
Donc,
the
pour
method
ceux
was
et
used
celles
in
d'entre
the
vous qui ne sont
Aging in the
pas
Right Place
familiers ou familières
program.
avec
So
cette
for those of you
méthode
who are
de
not
cueillette de
familiar with
données-là,
this
il
data
s'agit d'une
collection
approche
method,
collaborative dans
it's
la
a
recherche
collaborative
qualitative dans laquelle on
approach
demande aux
to
personnes participantes de
qualitative
prendre des photos
research participants are asked to take pictures of their daily lives or elements that are related to the research subject. So we asked participants to take pictures of what, according to them, helped them or prevented them from feeling they were in the right place to live or to age in this housing resource. So we had 29 interviews with 11 participants. It was a series of 3 interviews per individual for most of them. 9 of the 11 participants completed the whole photo voice process, while 2 considered they had shared enough with the research team after the first interview. So they did not want to pursue the photo voice process. So the 2 first interviews of the series of 3 interviews consisted in exploring what happened in their lives before being relocated to the transition home, and talking about how the transition to the home happened. And then we explored their daily lives in the transition home. In these 2 interviews, we gave them we gave them the cameras that they were going to use, disposable cameras, and we explained to them how to take the pictures and what they had to take pictures of. In the third interview, we sat down with them, looking at all the pictures each participant had taken, and we explored the content of these pictures and asked them to provide a title to each of the images. To analyze this very broad, rich, and complex corpus of pictures, we decided to use the interpretative phenomenology analysis. And one of the key aspects here is double hermeneutics, which implies that the researcher tries to understand the meaning or give meaning to the experience, or give meaning to the way the participants are trying to give meaning to their experience through photo voice and through the pictures they decided to take, and taking into account the interpretation they have of these pictures. All of this is happening through a theoretical perspective too. When we started holding the interviews, the theme of grievance was quite major, and as a research team, we were very familiar with this theme. So we decided to explore the data corpus from this existential dimension of grievance, which is what guided our analysis, because it's very present in the corpus of pictures. So we can move to the next slide. As you can imagine, and as Jeff said earlier, all participants we met had lived homelessness, they had lived experience, and they had suffered several losses, whether they were losses that happened a long time ago that had indirectly or directly led to their present situation. So these losses were related or not related to their homelessness situation. And sometimes these were situations or losses that were related to homelessness itself. So homelessness had caused loss of significant places, personal objects, loss of friends, of memories. For example, Frank, one of the participants, explained that when he became homeless, he had lost all the pictures of his daughter that was a child, and that created another loss for him. That is, to be able to fully perform his duties, parental duties. And in his view, the father is the guardian of these memories, and he had lost all the pictures of his daughter when she was a child. So we can imagine too that moving to a transition home doesn't magically resolve these issues. And what's unfortunate and sad is, and which is something we've seen, is that for several participants, being relocated to the housing or transition housing added another layer of grievance, of grief on top of the other grievances they had suffered. So the feeling of solitude and isolation is something that was quite common about the participants, especially when they moved in. So because for some of them, moving into a transition home meant they had to stop engaging in family activities. or other social
ça
activities, for
révèle pour
example,
eux un
asking
moyen, en
money
fait,
off the
de leur
street.
permettre
These
d'interagir avec
activities
d'autres
allowed
personnes qui est
them
devenu
to
important
interact
puis
with people who had
signifiant
become
pour elles au
important
fil du
and
temps.
significant for them
Il y avait
over
aussi
time,
le
and
fait
they
que
couldn't do
vivre
that
dans une
anymore
résidence
when
pour
they lived
personnes
in this
âgées, ça
residence.
faisait en sorte
And
que
also
certains
living
se
in
sentaient
an
très
elders residence
indifférents d'un
made it
peu
so that
l'image qu'ils
several
avaient
people,
d'eux-mêmes,
participants,
alors
had a
qu'elles se
very
voyaient
different image of
encore comme étant
themselves, while
relativement jeunes. Donc, il y avait aussi
they
cette
perceived themselves
transition-là
as
vers une
being still
ressource
relatively
d'hébergement
young.
pour
So
personnes âgées qui amenait
going through that
spectre
transition
là d'une
home
jeunesse qui était assez
made them
superficielle.
lose that
Même si elles
the
pouvaient rester en
the
contact avec leurs proches par
the youthhood
téléphone
that they
par
had. So even
Internet,
though they could
deux
keep in
ressources qui
contact
étaient
with their
disponibles là, dans la ressource
family
d'hébergement
members
transitoire, il
or
reste quand
friends
même que
by
beaucoup de
phone or
personnes
through the internet,
rencontrées
through the
impliquaient
resources
de
that were in
parler
the transition
se
home,
retrouvaient
a
dans
lot
des
of
ressources
residents
d'hébergement pour personnes en situation d'itinérance, ce qui venait un peu impacter
telling their
l'orientation
friends and
qu'ils pouvaient
family
avoir
that they
avec
were
d'autres
living in
résidents.
transition home, which had an
Les
impact on
interactions avec
their
les autres
social
résidents
relationships.
aussi étaient également
Interactions with
limitées parce que
other residents were
beaucoup
limited too,
considéraient ne pas
because
avoir
many of them
grand-chose en
considered
fait
they
de
didn't have
commun avec
much
les
in
autres
common
résidents de leur
with the
ressource
other
d'hébergement
residents
et ils
of
voulaient
the
surtout pas partager le
transition
stigma
home,
qui
and
était
they
associé au fait de se
especially
retrouver
didn't
dans une
want to
ressource
share the
d'hébergement pour
stigma
personnes en situation
uh,
d'itinérance.
that they had because they were living
Ce
in a
manque-là de
transition home
relations qu'on
for
pourrait
homeless
qualifier
people.
d'authentiques ou de
This
pleinement
lack of
significatives, mais ça constituait en soi un
significant
défi important.
relationships
La
caused another
photographie qu'on voit
loss.
ici, qui a été
The
prise par
picture we see
Paul,
here that
qui
was
a
taken
intitulé
by Paul,
Solitude, puis
he,
surtout
that he called
l'interprétation qu'il
Solitude,
faisait
and
de
especially
cette
the interpretation he
photo-là,
made of this
transmet assez
photo,
puissamment cette
uh,
déconnexion-là que plusieurs
shows
pouvaient
full
ressentir.
well this
Donc, le
disconnect that
sentiment que cette
several
expérience de
participants could
solitude
feel. So the
profonde-là les
feeling
amenait à
of
perdre une part de leur
profound
humanité même.
isolation
Pour Paul,
and
c'était
solitude
de
made
se
them lose
sentir
part of their
presque comme
humanity.
un animal, non
Paul
plus comme un
felt
humain.
almost like an
La
animal
majorité des
and not
personnes participantes
instead of
ont
a
pris des
human. So
photos de
most participants
l'horloge de
took
la salle
pictures
à
of
manger, témoignant
the
aussi de l'importance de la temporalité puis
clock
des transformations aussi
in
de
the
leur
common
rapport au
room,
temps dans leur expérience de
which
la ressource d'hébergement. Il y a plusieurs
shows their
participants qui nous ont
relationship to
parlé en fait
time.
d'un sentiment
As
de
several participants
stagnation.
talked about
Donc
the
leur
feeling
journée
of
était toujours
stagnation. So
rythmée
their
par des
days
passants
were
structurés
always
autour
the
des
same,
repas qui
structured
leur étaient
around the
servis ou des
meals that were
rendez-vous
provided to
avec leur
them,
intervenant qui étaient
around the
planifiés pour
appointments
eux,
that they were
ce qui
planned
laissait
for
peu de
them
place dans
with
leur vie à
their social
l'indépendance
support,
puis
which
l'engagement,
gave
mais il y
them
avait
very little
aussi un peu
independence and
l'affaire
little
de
room
deuil.
for engagement that
Il y
they
a
needed
plusieurs participants
to
pour qui
do
c'était
to grief.
rassurant,
For
cette
several participants,
quotidienneté-là, cette
this
structure-là, mais il
daily
y en avait
routine was
beaucoup aussi
reassuring,
qui
but
craignaient
many
de perdre leur
participants
capacité à
were
vivre seuls un
afraid to
jour, ce qui était
lose their
plus ou moins
ability to
attendu
live
aussi
alone
dans le cadre de cette
one day, which is
ressource-là
something that was
transitoire qui
expected
devait mener
in this
éventuellement à un
transition
hébergement
home that was supposed to
plus
lead
permanent.
to more permanent
Donc,
housing
la
afterwards.
nature justement
So the
transitoire et
nature
à long terme de la
of
ressource faisait que plusieurs
transitional
résidents se sentaient en quelque sorte
nature of the
coincés.
resources
Donc,
made it
les
so that
résidents
several
savaient qu'ils
participants
devraient
felt they
éventuellement
were
partir, mais
trapped.
sans
A
vraiment
lot of participants knew
savoir
they would have to
quand
leave one day,
viendrait
but
leur
they didn't know
tour, ce
when
qui les rendait
their
extrêmement
time
anxieux,
or
comme on peut
their
le voir là,
turn would
dans
come,
cette
which made them very
citation-là que je
anxious,
vous ai
as we can see in this
partagée
quote that
de
I
Pat.
shared
Donc, il y a plusieurs
from Pat.
participants qui nous ont
So
parlé de leur
several participants
hésitation, puis même
talked
de
about
leur
their
très grande crainte de
um,
devoir partir, même
the
s'ils
fact they were
reconnaissaient que
afraid
le
and
confort de la
hesitant to
chambre
leave,
qu'ils
even
avaient
though they
attribuée
recognized that the
était
comfort of the room that was
extrêmement
given to them
limité.
was
Pour eux, déménager, ça
was
signifiait
very
quand même
beneficial.
peut-être devoir
Moving
faire
to
face à
them
d'autres pertes.
meant
Surtout
to
si les
be
seules
facing other
options
losses,
de
especially the
logement
only housing
abordables se trouvaient
options,
dans des quartiers très, très
affordable housing
éloignés,
options
parce
were
qu'en fait,
very
la ressource
in
qu'on
neighborhoods that were very
étudiait
far
était
away
vraiment
because the
située de
resource
façon centrale, dans un quartier
transitional
central
home
de
was
Montréal,
very
donc très, très près
central
des lieux qui étaient familiers
in
à
Montreal,
la
so very
majorité
close
des personnes
to
participantes à la recherche.
the
On peut
neighborhoods and
penser que c'était
locations that the
aussi.
most participants were familiar with
Donc, il y a
in the
plusieurs
center of Montreal.
résidents et personnes participantes à notre recherche qui
Several
pensaient au
residents and
début, quand ils
participants
aménageaient dans la ressource
thought at the beginning
d'hébergement, que
when
le
they were
fait d'être
moving into
hébergés
the
de
transitional
manière
home
plus stable,
that
ça leur permettrait
being
enfin
housed in a
de
more
vivre
stable
les
way
deuils
would
qui étaient liés
finally
à la
allow
perte qu'ils
them
avaient vécue
to
par
go
le
through
passé
the
et qui
grief
vivaient aussi dans un
for the
présent plus ou moins
losses they had
expansif,
suffered in the past,
puis que ça leur permettrait
and that
aussi de
this
les
would
aider
allow
à mieux se
them
préparer pour des pertes
to
qui
better
seraient à
prepare
venir.
for future
Donc, au début de
losses.
leur séjour à la
At the beginning
ressource,
of
la
their stay at
majorité
the
se
resources,
sentait vraiment
most of
plein
them
d'espoir.
felt
La
full of
photographie
hope.
que vous voyez
The
à
picture
gauche,
you
qui
see
est
on the
prise par
left
Sergio,
was
qui l'a
taken by
intitulée
Sergio
Calm,
that called it
il
calm.
a pris cette photo-là
He took this photo only a month after moving into the housing resource. And this shows optimism, the optimism that the participants were mentioning. So this picture called calm means to be able to settle down and to start the grieving process and restart living from that point on. However, living in this transitional home meant that very quickly participants realized that they didn't have much time or space to address the grievances they were going through. So stability allowed the grief to come back, but there is almost nothing they could do, or there was almost nothing prepared for them to go through this grief that was coming back. So instead of helping them reconnect with them and the world around them, while they were not supported or not recognized in this grief and these losses, they oftentimes became even more isolated. So the gap between them and their life history was widening. A powerful an extreme example of this type of isolation that could happen is a participant that shared to us in his interview that he learned to stop talking when the time came to talk about difficult experiences, about the losses he accumulated in his life, because he was afraid that mentioning his suicidal thoughts would lead to the intervention of the police, which is something that happened to him in the past, and it was going to add even more distress to his experience, even though the uh, the staff wanted to make sure he was safe and help him. Another extreme example is the fact that several participants talked about the fact that it was impossible to talk about the grief with with the staff because the appointments were often planned well in advance and didn't coincide with moments where they needed support or they wanted to talk about grief, or the time they had with the staff was so short that they preferred to use that time to have assistance in taking appointments or managing forms and other red tape that would allow them to to resolve their situation, their administrative situation. So oftentimes this led to despair. So the photo you see on the right was taken by Frank that called it "It's Dark." It's a picture that Frank took 2 years after 2 years living in the home, and it shows this feeling of despair that can settle in when you're in persisting um, in persisting grief.
Donc, cette étude-là a montré une tension finalement
This
entre deux
study
processus. D'une part, la
showed tension between
réaffiliation,
two
qui est
processes.
généralement
First of
utilisée
all,
dans les
the
pratiques de
reaffiliation,
logement
which
ou
is
de
often
l'offre
a priority in
psychosociale, qui vise dans le fond à
homes where
favoriser le
psychosocial support
sens
is
et les liens dans
offered.
la vie de la
It
personne qui a vécu
aims
l'itinérance.
to
Et en parallèle, la
reconnect with
perturbation des
self
processus de
or
deuil
others,
par des barrières
and
structurelles qui empêchent
it
finalement
provides
les
structural
résidents de vivre ou
barriers
d'adresser les
that
deuils qui
prevent
sont vécus.
residents from
Cette
living their
tension-là
grief and
signifie que
addressing their
bien
grief.
que dans une
This
approche
tension
de
means that
réaffiliation, on souhaiterait aider les résidents
even
à
though in
se
a
reconnecter à
reaffiliation
eux-mêmes,
approach,
à leur histoire de
we
vie,
want
aux
residents
autres,
to
à se
reconnect
resynchroniser aussi
with
avec les leurs
themselves, others,
processus
and
partagés, puis à donner
resynchronize their
du
life with
sens aussi aux pertes
society
qu'ils ont
and give
vécues,
meaning to the
qui émergent
losses
ou qui
they've
réémergent.
suffered
Mais il y a certaines
as
pratiques dans
they
la ressource qui
emerge and reemerge.
perturbent en fait ce
There are certain
processus de
practices
deuil-là, puis
in
qui peut
this resource
créer
that
ou exacerber
disrupt this
l'asynchronie ou la
grief process and
précarité qui est vécue par les
um,
résidents, ce qui est finalement à l'opposé de ce qu'on
that
souhaite
can
là, dans une
make the
approche
situation
qui
worse. They
vise
can make
la
the grief
réaffiliation.
bigger. And
Donc, ce que ça implique, c'est que les résidents peuvent se sentir encore plus
residents
déconnectés,
can
plus
feel even more
bloqués,
disconnected,
ce qui rend paradoxalement aussi
even
le
more
fait d'aller de
blocked,
l'avant pour eux
which makes
encore
it
plus difficile.
even more
On
difficult
peut
for them to
changer
move
de
forward.
diapositive. Donc, ces résultats suggèrent pour
The
nous
results of this
trois
study
implications. Il
suggest
y en a
three
d'autres
implications. There are
qu'on a
others
soulevées dans l'article,
that
mais
we
ici, on avait
raised in the
envie de mettre
article,
l'accent
but
sur
we wanted to focus
ces
on
trois
these
aspects-là.
three
Donc,
aspects.
ça nous semble nécessaire, en fait, d'essayer de
It's
penser à des moyens
we think it's
de
necessary to
permettre, en fait,
think
aux
about
intervenants d'avoir plus
ways
de
to
temps et
allow
d'espace
the personnel
dans
to
leur
the staff to have more
intervention pour
time
être
and
en mesure,
space
en
in
fait,
their
d'offrir un
interventions
soutien qui
so
est
that
plus flexible, puis un accompagnement aussi qui est plus
they can
sensible à
support
la
more
question du
flexible
deuil.
support and be
Être
more
en mesure
sensitive
aussi
to
de
grief
réviser
of the
certaines
residents.
règles au sein de la
It would
ressource
be
qui
also
peuvent
important to review
parfois
certain rules
entraver le
in the
processus de
home
deuil,
that can
notamment le fait de
sometimes
ne pas
um,
pouvoir garder un
uh,
pied dans certaines
prevent
activités qui étaient
grief from
liées à
happening. For
leur
example,
situation d'itinérance précédentes ou encore de ne pas pouvoir cuisiner par eux-mêmes.
Things that would, for example, not allowing residents to cook by themselves and such regulations. And finally, we may want to reconsider the implication of transitional for housing for residents
Amener certains deuils à ne pas pouvoir s'exprimer
and
pleinement.
consider how some types of griefs may not be able to express themselves fully and be lived fully by the resident. That's all I wanted to present. I will pass the microphone to Jeff.
Thank you so much, Émilie. It's always interesting to hear about the research that you do. And so I'm gonna shift and focus on the study that I did, which focuses on the intersections of homelessness and palliative care in Canadian policy. And I'll start by kind of discussing it more broadly, and then focus on the one finding that is relevant for today, which is bereavement and spousal loss when it comes to working with older adults. Next slide. So we've already covered some of this, but I just want to always like to remind people, we talked about the increased need for palliative care and bereavement supports with older adults experiencing homelessness. We kind of have two things that are happening. We have increased rates of chronic illness, which kind of lead to prolonged dying. And so people experience grief and loss through this kind of longer chronic illness, but also through sudden death, which we don't necessarily always think about when we think about palliative care, but certainly there's experiences of grief and loss and bereavement from an overdose crisis, as well as exposure that happens for older homeless peoples. Despite having this kind of increased need and increased exposure to death and dying, they also, older people experiencing homelessness, experience barriers to most palliative care services. And what happens then is, people still have palliative needs, and it ends up typically being that homelessness services act as a de facto palliative care provider. They tend to already have established relationships and connections and trust. Um, However, they're providing the care without training and resources. And so what ends up happening is when we look at the literature and we talk to service providers in the homelessness sector, there's a lot of distress that happens for them because they feel like they're providing the care, or they are providing the care, but they feel like they don't have the resources, the knowledge, the skills to do it in a good way. And so there's a real role here for policymakers. And so they play this role in naming and discussing an issue. They play a role in allocating resources, but also providing guidance, training, direction. Prior to our study, there was little known to the extent that policies actually discussed palliative care for people experiencing homelessness. Next slide. So to kind of understand what we were or what was being discussed in Canadian policy documents, we did conduct a content analysis of both Canadian palliative care documents and homelessness policy documents. And we had this big question was how, if at all, do these Canadian documents discuss palliative care for people who are experiencing homelessness? And we analyzed it in a few different ways. We looked for the geographic scope. So was it a municipal document? Was it a provincial document or territorial? Or was it national? The level of discussion, which I'll talk a little bit in the next slide, what that means. But then we also looked at the content of the discussion. So what concepts did they discuss? Next slide. So in total, we found 75 policy documents. 42 of them were homelessness policies, and 33 of them were palliative care policies. And when we talk about policy documents, we made a decision early on to only focus on what we would call higher level Canadian policy documents. We used a framework to kind of define that, but really those documents are ones that are higher level in terms of providing guiding principles, setting priorities, discussing or recommending practices, as well as legislation that were and they would be used by organizations to set priorities, direct programmatic models, and really for them to think about what to implement in terms of their operations. But we did not include policies that were on the operational level. And so also the other piece was that we only focused on policies that, or we only included policies that focused on either palliative care or homelessness. And we made a decision to exclude larger community health strategies or poverty reduction plans that may have these components embedded in it, but because they weren't discussing the issue in their entirety, we made the decision to exclude it because it made it hard for us to kind of understand, are they discussing poverty or palliative care in the context of poverty or just in general? And what we ended up doing was categorizing all the policy documents that we included into the level of discussion. So there was many policy documents, 42 of the 75 that had no discussion. And then we also had policy documents that were indirect, minimal, and significant. Indirect discussion was not originally part of the categories we created, but when we started to actually read the documents, we realized there's a discussion that's happening where they don't necessarily directly name palliative care or homelessness, but it's adjacent, or there was kind of a vague or broader concepts. So, homelessness frameworks may talk about chronic health and premature death, but maybe don't actually mention palliative care. Um, some palliative care frameworks may talk about poverty or mental health and substance use, but not actually directly name homelessness. But we decided to include them in terms of this new indirect discussion. And then minimal discussion, policies named palliative care for people who are experiencing homelessness. But oftentimes they didn't provide any, or for minimal, they didn't provide any further elaboration. So a really common example of that would be listing homelessness populations as experiencing barriers to care alongside several other equity deserving populations. So an example would be that people experiencing homelessness, there are many populations out there who experience barriers when accessing palliative care, including people experiencing homelessness, incarcerated peoples, Indigenous peoples, rural populations. So it was kind of included in these larger um, lists, but there was no engagement with what was being discussed. And so we had 13 policies for indirect discussion and 14 for minimal. And then the last one, we had 6 policies that had significant discussion. And those are policies that named homelessness and or palliative care for people who are experiencing homelessness, but then went further than just listing them. So they provided some additional comments, suggestions, guidance, direction, and in some cases also provided critique. Next slide. Sorry. So I'm not going to get into all the concepts that we pulled out from the discussions. I just wanted to provide a list because I do know that this is going to go out to folks, so they may find some interest in some of the other ones. But the 2 things that I will note is if we look at, there's many different concepts there, and there's actually only a couple in which both homelessness policy documents and palliative care documents overlap and have a shared discussion. And that's unique palliative care needs for older people experiencing homelessness and interventions and practices for older people experiencing homelessness. We found discussions of that in both palliative care and homelessness strategies, although they actually did discuss different things. Today, we're going to focus more on, or we're going to focus on the bolded one, which is bereavement and risk of homelessness. And that was a discussion that was only found in homelessness policies. Next slide. So just a little bit of difference between the sectors before we talk about the bereavement piece. When we analyzed the palliative care frameworks, we found that there was a much greater discussion of homelessness than the homelessness frameworks discussing palliative care. We also found more policies at the national, provincial, and territorial levels. But a lot of the discussion frequently just consisted of what I mentioned earlier, which was listing older people experiencing homelessness within these broader lists of equity deserving populations. And when we look at the palliative care policy documents, about a third did not include any discussion of homelessness when it comes to palliative care. The other side was the homelessness documents. And so some of the things that we pulled out from that is that none of the homelessness documents significantly discussed palliative care, and that there was no policies at the national level that discussed palliative care for people experiencing homelessness. And we also noticed that three-quarters of the policies that we analyzed did not mention palliative care at all. So we're seeing, that's why we see that, or we mentioned that we see this greater discussion of homelessness, or it's more frequently discussed in palliative care frameworks than homelessness. One of the things that I think surprised me was that there was this discussion around bereavement and older people experiencing homelessness that was absent from the palliative care documents. And we see that in a few documents. Next slide. So as I mentioned, in total, there were 4 homelessness documents that discussed bereavement, grief, and loss. And those discussions were found in policy documents that had indirect or minimal discussion. We mentioned there was no policy documents that had within the homelessness sector that had a significant discussion. The most of the indirect discussion were just mentioning that there's higher rates of homelessness following spousal loss. And then the ones that did have minimal discussion, they actually contain that similar discussion around higher rates of homelessness following spousal loss. And then also included some other discussions around palliative care separate from bereavement that pushed them over into minimal discussion. And that discussion echoes the literature that we see. So there's an increased risk of homelessness for older people who are experiencing who experience a spousal loss. And for those who are already homeless, there's a lack of recognition or acknowledgement of their grief and bereavement and their rights as a spouse. And I just want to have a bigger discussion around that. So when we've noticed there's a discussion in the policy documents around bereavement and spousal loss being a risk factor for homelessness for older adults, particularly for women. And then when we compare that to the literature, they mention the unique barriers that face older adults when they experience a spousal death. And a big piece of that is that they often don't meet the legal definition of being common law. And there's a few reasons why that happens. Two of the biggest ones would be when individuals don't have a fixed address, they often aren't recognized as cohabitating. So even if they are living together in encampments or shelters, they often would not be recognized as cohabitating. And so they're not able to claim common law status or have that recognized or their common law status recognized. And the other piece is that even for folks who are housed, sometimes they're housed in low-income housing, supportive housing that may have restrictive housing policies. So there may be a policy that allows only one tenant to a room or to an apartment. And in those cases, it creates a barrier for people to be legally recognized as a spouse because they can't live there or they can't use that address and say that they were living there. And then what happens is after spousal death, there's difficulty in terms of people having their property rights acknowledged. And that can be anything from, a place where they were living, all the way down to really sentimental things like clothing or mementos, which many of us think about when we experience losses in our own life. The other one would be financial survivor benefits. So particularly, we're talking about really economically vulnerable folks. And so losing a spouse also means potentially losing some of the financial supports that they've been having. And then because they don't actually have a recognized common law status, um, it's difficult or impossible for them to apply for survivor benefits through like CPP and things like that. And then another one is around the post-death decision making. So even decisions around what will happen with bodies, will people be buried or cremated, something that a spouse may have had much greater knowledge of. They may not be recognized because they're not viewed as a spouse, and that can become particularly difficult if sometimes when a estranged family comes into the picture who are legally recognized but may not actually have the knowledge around what that person's wishes were. Next slide. And so from that, based on what we've read in the policy documents and connecting that with the literature, we really created two different recommendations. One that focuses on older people who are already experiencing homelessness, and one for people who are, so for housed older adults who are at risk of homelessness. And so the first recommendation is, to create laws and policies which recognize the relationships of older people who are experiencing homelessness, despite that barrier to traditionally recognized cohabitation, so that we can uphold, the property, the financial, and the decision-making rights of older people experiencing homelessness following the loss of a spouse. And so that one really focuses on people who are already experiencing homelessness. Our second recommendation focuses more on allocating resources and developing training guidelines to better support and prevent homelessness for older adults when they do lose a spouse. So that could be things like financial or tangible resources, and then also training staff so they know how to navigate that, and providing bereavement programs so that people do have someone who can inform them of their options and their resources so that we prevent older adults from becoming homeless. Next slide. And so, we integrated our recommendations throughout our webinar, but we also just want to highlight that there's a lot of opportunities and benefits for the homelessness and housing sector to really integrate and make grief and loss much more vulnerable. We talk about policies that can be implemented or created. We talked about practice and program level things that could be done in order to really support people who are experiencing grief and loss, whether it's from the loss of a spouse or from the loss of the home opportunities, identity, things like that. Next slide. Just a thank you, and also just a couple of links there if you want to more information about aging in the right place. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Jumping back in here and inviting participants to put any of your questions into the Q&A box. And we have a few more minutes to sort of carry on the conversation, so I encourage you all to do that. And I'm just looking in the chat here as well. Thank you, Sam, for that invitation and resources. And by all means, those of you who are practitioners in this space to share those resources with one another as a way to enhance the conversation. I have a question for you to maybe get us warmed up. So one of the interesting and maybe this is my lack of expertise or my own experience or perception, I'm seeing perhaps some dissonance between the palliative care facility approach and some of the research that you uncovered, or some of the detail that you uncovered, Émilie, in your review of transitional housing and the impact of that, not displacement, but sort of reallocation of someone and the grief that emerges in that process. One could see that that might reoccur by being transitioned yet again into some sort of palliative care setting. Was there any discussion or review of that potential scenario in your work?
J'ai pas de témoignages
I don't have
scientifiques,
any
d'articles
scientific
que j'aurais lus à
testimony
ce
or
sujet-là. Par
paper I would have
contre,
read about this.
je sais que
However,
dans certaines ressources
I
à
do know that in
Montréal,
some
quand moi j'ai
resources in
commencé à faire
Montreal,
mon
when
projet de
I
doctorat, ma
started
recherche
my
doctorale, on avait
PhD
un peu de
research,
difficulté à
we were
recruter
having
des
a hard
personnes
time
qui utilisaient
recruiting
des
people
ressources
who were using
palliatives
palliative
dans les refuges ou
resources
qui étaient
in
affiliés à
transition
des
homes
organismes
or
qui venaient
who
en
were
aide aux
affiliated
personnes
to
en situation
organizations
d'itinérance. Et
helping
potentiellement, c'est un peu
homeless people.
cet enjeu-là là, qui était là,
And that
parce
is the issue
qu'éventuellement, ce qu'ils se sont mis
that we
à
were
faire,
facing
c'est
because what they started doing eventually
d'assurer un soutien aux
was
personnes
to
à partir
provide
du moment où il y
support
avait
to
un
individuals
diagnostic, même si on n'était pas
after they
encore dans une
received the
maladie qui était
diagnosis, even
incurable,
though
pour
they
déjà créer ce
still didn't
lien-là
have
pour
an
éviter en
incurable
fait que
disease,
cette
because they wanted
transition-là
to
se fasse
avoid
dans l'urgence
for
à la
this
toute fin
transition
de
to
la vie
happen
et que potentiellement,
in
justement, ça
in
provoque là,
as an
certains
emergency
deuils,
at the
certaines
very
pertes
end
qui
of
pourraient
life,
être difficiles
which
à
would have caused
métaboliser là, avant
more
que la fin de vie arrive. Donc, ce serait un peu ce
bereavement
que moi, j'ai pu voir
and
ici
at
à
the end of
Montréal. Je ne
life.
sais
So
pas,
that's
Jeff,
what I saw here in Montreal. I don't know if
s'il y a
Jeff
d'autres choses de votre côté qui
saw the
s'ajoutent.
same thing or different things on his end of Canada.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things that happen. So I can speak about hospice care, and
Mm.
when we talk about people who are experiencing homelessness, we're talking about people who often are surviving, who don't have access to just the things that some of us take for granted, food, clothing, shelter, safety, um, and heat, lots of different things. And so sometimes what we see are people transitioning into hospice because they're end of life, and we think that that death is going to take place maybe within the next 3 months. And then once they actually have access to the things that we really do take for granted, the things that actually make us stronger and promote health, they end up living much longer. And so there's um, this shift that's happening, I think, within hospices to go, well, obviously, we can't just look at this like it's a hospice with a general population. There's some shifts that are happening in terms of like allowing people to stay longer. I know some of the hospice I've talked to also have set up um, pathways into transitional housing. So it's a really interesting thing for people to transition out of hospice into maybe more long-term housing, but those things have been set up because when I mean, I don't think any of us are going to be surprised when we actually give people the things that they need to promote their health, they end up doing better. So.
J'ajouterais aussi que dans la collecte de données qu'on a fait dans cette
In the data
ressource-là
collection we did
spécifiquement
in that
d'hébergement de
specific
transitoire
resource,
à
that
long terme,
transition,
un
a
des
long-term
souhaits de
transition home,
beaucoup de résidents,
many
c'était de pouvoir en
residents
fait finir leur
wanted
jour dans cette
to end their
ressource-là.
life
Puis
in
que
that
malheureusement, les
establishment, in
ressources
that residence. And unfortunately,
de cet hébergement-là ne permettaient
the
pas
resources of
cet
that transition home
accompagnement en
did
fin de
not
vie.
allow for this
Donc,
support at
effectivement,
the end
dans
of
cette
life.
ressource-là,
So
qui
in
pourtant
that
accueille des personnes
long-term
âgées de
transition
50 ans
home
et plus,
that
dont la santé est
has
souvent
50
largement
years and over
hypothéquée, c'est
residents
pas quelque chose
who
qui est
have
possible
health
pour eux
problems, it's
de
not
finir
possible
leur
for
jour
them
dans cette
to end their
ressource-là.
life in that
Parce que c'est
resource,
pas possible de
in that
coordonner
home,
les
because
services
it's not
publics,
possible to
parce que
coordinate
eux n'ont
public
pas le financement
services,
non
or
plus
because
pour
the resource
fournir un
doesn't have the
accompagnement
funding to
24 heures sur
provide
24 avec un
24/7
suivi
support
médical
with medical
rapproché.
support.
Donc, ouais, il y a encore beaucoup, beaucoup de chemin à faire à
So
ce
we
niveau-là.
still have a long way to go.
Considering that point, Émilie, the ideal potentially being that opportunity would be available and that security and that sense of stability would exist within that transitional housing space to allow them to be able to remain and be well supported.
Oui, il me semble.
To not have to re-engage with that cycle of grief yet again. Are there any other closing thoughts that either of you would like to share before we close out our session today? Anything that occurs to you in the moment? I'm seeing lots of love for you both and the work that you're doing and the work that you're bringing forward to the sector as important to consider in our continued policy development in particular.
The only thing I'll say is that if there are, I mean, if there's more questions today, I'm happy to answer them. But I know sometimes if anyone's like me, you walk away and you think about things, and maybe in an hour or a day or a week, a month, whenever you might have a question. I'm so happy to chat with people and answer those. So please feel free to reach out.
Tout à fait. Je vois aussi qu'il y a une question dans
I see
dans
there's a question in the Q&R section,
je la trouve vraiment
the Q&A,
super
and
question parce que effectivement
I think it's a great question because indeed it's not an aspect we covered in our presentation, but indeed it is one of the aspects of using bereavement as a perspective on the experience of people living with homelessness. And I think it's a way to get back to our common humanity and to, so to speak, provoke this humanity among decision makers, regular people, people who are not homeless, so that people could identify or associate to this situation that people, homeless people, lived. It's not the same situation, but I think it's very positive that you've understood this aspect.
Thank you for catching that, Émilie. And I think, Jackie, an excellent point to be made in the context of this discussion. Absolutely. And for many of us, this is a major assumption that we have some sense of connection to this experience of grief and loss. And let that be a uniting experience for us to better understand what others might need. Yeah. As promised, I wanted to just quickly share how you can stay connected to the conversation and maybe access Émilie and Jeff and further resources. And that's through the Expert Community on Housing, which is the initiative, also an NHS initiative that supports this webinar series. So please join if you haven't already. There are already lots of amazing resources there, as well as all of our past webinars, including the webinars that the AIRP collective has hosted over the years. We are in the process of forming various communities of practice that are specifically thematically focused. And so there may be opportunities there for you as practitioners to find one another and collaborate on some of these thematics that are close to your heart and close to your work. So this QR or the web link is your way to connect with us and join the community. And just a quick plug for what we have coming up next. We have another webinar scheduled on March 20th. The registration information for that, I'm going to quickly throw into the chat so that you can join us there. It'll be exploring rural housing data. I'm doing too many things at once here. But we'd love to have you there and again, share the resources from all the different areas that do in many ways intersect. So closing out, most importantly, thank you, Jeff and Émilie, for sharing your work with us today. And thank you all for joining in. We appreciate you being here. We feel the warmth and do stay connected. We'll be sending a follow-up email, as I mentioned, with the recordings and Jeff and Émilie's contact information so you can follow up directly with them. Many, many thanks to all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Merci.
I always overestimate how many things I can do at once. Okay, I'll just throw something in the chat. I'll just change the slides. Thank you both so much.
Merci à vous.
Yeah. Yes, thanks for organizing this.
Our pleasure. All right, I'm going to head out, and I think, Vero, we can close out the session. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
You too. Bye.
Have a good afternoon too. Bye bye.